Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Doug Dammann, and I'm the Educational Coordinator and Site Coordinator at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. For those of you who might not be familiar with our museum here in the southeastern corner of the state of Wisconsin, we look at the Civil War through the lens of the 7 states of the upper Midwest. So the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, and really look at the importance of the war to not only those men that served in the federal army from those 7 states, but also the impact on the communities and the citizens of those 7 states, both leading up to the war, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. And so I'm hoping today that this talk will introduce some of you to our museum facility and inspire you to come visit us when you're in the Milwaukee or Chicago areas, and also teach you a little bit about our subject matter today, Elmer Ellsworth in the United States Zouave Cadets. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, Elmer Ellsworth, he was colonel of the 11th New York Infantry, killed very early in the Civil War in Alexandria, Virginia. You may know that about him. And you may be thinking, well, what the heck does Elmer Ellsworth have to do with the upper Midwest? And so that's my charge today, is to tell you that about Ellsworth. We're going to start with his life and really go into a study of why he's important and how he connects to the upper Midwest and specifically to Chicago. Now, my own personal interest in Ellsworth grew out of the fact that I lived in Alexandria for a number of years. My wife worked for the city of Alexandria, and the city offices are right across the street from the Marshall House Hotel where Ellsworth was killed in 1861. I had been to the Fort Ward Museum in Alexandria and seen their amazing collection of Ellsworth materials. So I always assumed that Ellsworth was a New York story. He commanded a New York regiment, as we already talked about. It wasn't until that I moved to Kenosha that I was able to study a collection of objects that we had in our museum from the Lake Forest Academy, just north of Chicago. They had lent the objects to us, that I began to understand that Ellsworth and his story was deeply rooted in the upper Midwest. And the more I looked into Ellsworth, the more I began to realize his importance as a military commander. Even though he hadn't commanded a corps or division or brigade on any battlefield, I found that his influence on other soldiers is what really made him important. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is his influence that lived on after his death in May of 1861. And so when I was doing this, I was struggling, what sort of visual representation, what sort of analogy could I use with Ellsworth to kind of explain that influence? And as an avid Packer fan living in Wisconsin, I came up with the coaching staff of the 1992 Green Bay Packers. For me, it was crystal clear, but let me explain. You see in the middle there, for those of you who don't know the history of the Packers, the head coach at that time was Mike Holmgren. They went on to win the Super Bowl in 1996. On his staff here surrounding him are individuals like John Gruden and Ray Rhodes, Nolan Cromwell, Sherman Lewis, and Andy Reid, you see on the lower right. What I'm getting at is that Holmgren's influence on the rest of these coaches was great. And as they went up and left the Packers, they began to take on leadership roles and head coaching positions in other NFL organizations. We're going to see Ellsworth's influence similar to Holmgren's in that as the men leave his regiment or his influence and what they learned from him in Chicago and Illinois, they take on leadership roles within the federal army. So that's the parallel, and that's the analogy that I'm using today. So let's explore Ellsworth's early life. Well, he was born in 1837 in Saratoga County, New York. He was born into lower middle class parents. His father was a tailor who did odd jobs around town to make ends meet, and his mother ran a boarding house in their home to make extra money. Ellsworth's great-grandfather, George, had been a member of the Continental Army, and as Elmer grew, he desperately wanted to attend West Point, but he was unable to secure an appointment to that institution. He worked outside the home to support his family. He sold newspapers on a train line. He worked in a grocery store. But his real passion as a youth was military drill and tactics. And so what he did was he tried to learn as much as he could about that through independent study. We don't know much about Ellsworth in his early teenage years. He becomes harder to track as his life progresses. Here locally in Kenosha, there was a link to him in these early years. In 1917, an article was written in the Kenosha newspaper placing Ellsworth here in Kenosha, living in a boarding house in downtown Kenosha in 1853. A local man said that he knew Ellsworth, lived with him in that boarding house, and that they'd had experiences together. Ellsworth himself, I've never been able to find any primary sources from him linking him to Kenosha, but it was somewhat plausible that he might have been here. In 1845, Kenosha established one of the first free public education systems outside of New England. And in 1849, the city built a school building dedicated to free public education. In that year, over 500 students enrolled in the new school. Maybe Ellsworth was in town because of that opportunity. We just don't know. We do know that by 1854, he had moved to Chicago and was living in Chicago. He was working with a group of engineers on a project in Chicago. And we start to see evidence of his business dealings in town at that time. This is a business card from one of Ellsworth's early businesses in Chicago. He entered into a patent soliciting business with another young entrepreneur from the New England area by the name of Arthur Devereux. Now, Devereux is interesting in that his father was a citizen of considerable prominence in Massachusetts. His father served as the Adjutant General of Massachusetts and captain of the Salem Light Infantry, first beginning that role in 1834. Now, Arthur followed in his father's footsteps and was captain of that same militia company after he left Chicago in 1860. And Arthur Devereux later served in the Civil War as captain of the 8th Massachusetts and colonel of the 19th Massachusetts. Unfortunately for Ellsworth and Devereux, you can see the Devereux, Ellsworth and Company, they were in the patent soliciting business. The business ultimately failed, and Ellsworth lost a lot of money in that transaction. He blamed it on the unscrupulous actions of a third party, but this began a series of events in Ellsworth's life. He's never going to have a lot of money, and he's always struggling to just survive financially throughout his young life and time in Chicago. But we see evidence at this time that not only is Ellsworth engaged in these business dealings, but he's also still active in military affairs and drill. He always felt, and this was a quote, that God had made him a soldier and that any occupation not connected to the military seemed unfulfilling to him. He studied and mastered the two leading tactical manuals of the time, William Hardee's Rifle and Light Infantry Tactics and Winfield Scott's Infantry Tactics. Ellsworth also trained in Chicago and became known as an expert fencer in the city, an interest that led to a friendship and a partnership with a Frenchman named Dr. Charles Devillier, who was himself an expert French swordsman who immigrated to the United States after service with a French Zouave regiment during the Crimean War. You may recall the French Zouaves were an elite units who distinguished themselves with their unique uniforms and methods of training that combined athletic movements with gymnastics and military drill. They wore a unique uniform, baggy trousers, short jackets without collars, sometimes a fez, all of which was to pattern after troops from Algeria and Morocco who joined the French army in the 1830s. These striking uniforms were usually visually unique, but also afforded the men great range of movement. The Zouaves were trained to load and fire on the run while lying down or kneeling. They were also proficient in the use of the sword and the bayonet. So as Ellsworth and Devereux's friendship developed, Devereux taught Ellsworth everything that he knew about those French Zouaves. And so what we begin to see is that Ellsworth is going to combine what he's learning from Hardee and Scott with what he's learning from the French. Now, Ellsworth didn't have a command He was not part of the American Army at that time, but he became active in local upper Midwestern militias, the militia system at that time. Now, in 1860, there were an estimated just under 2,000 militia members serving in 52 companies in Wisconsin. So that kind of gives you a sense of what the militia system was like here in our state. The federal government supplied the state with 80 rifled muskets, 80 sets of infantry accoutrements, 40 sets of other military accoutrements, muskets, 20 artillery swords and belts, holsters, percussion rifles, etc. The arms were given to the commander-in-chief of the state militia, who was the governor, and to be distributed to individual militia companies. The governor had the power to disband any militia company to have them turn in their arms. So this is the system in which Ellsworth is going to become inundated into. And it's really going to start from him. You see his rise commanding Illinois militia companies beginning in December of 1857. Ellsworth was invited by General R.K. Swift to a banquet in Rockford, Illinois, a place called the Hoffman House in Rockford, Illinois. Now, Rockford is about 60, 70 miles west of Chicago, right in the north center of the state. But the dinner was held for leading militia leaders of Illinois. And at that dinner, the captain of the Rockford Militia Company, the Rockford City Grays, invited Ellsworth to come to Rockford and become drill master of his group the following summer. So Ellsworth accepted and drilled the company throughout the summer of 1858. The company was put through their paces at a 4-day militia encampment held at a place called Camp Sinisippi in Rockford in September of 1858. What you see on the slide is a broadside advertising that encampment at Camp Sinisippi. Other groups were invited to participate. The National Guard Cadets of Chicago and the Washington Continental Artillery of Elgin, Illinois, were also present. And really, it's at this encampment that we see Ellsworth debuting his hybrid Zouave system for the very first time. From Rockford, Ellsworth was invited north to Madison, Wisconsin, the capital of the state of Wisconsin. And he was invited to train a group of individuals known as the Governor's Guard. The company was made up of leading young men of Madison society. There were judges, lawyers, bankers, businessmen, all involved in the Guard. Some of the members of the Governor's Guard went on to serve as officers in the famed Iron Brigade of the West. And pictured are two of them here. On the left is Frank Haskell. He was adjutant of the 6th Wisconsin and later colonel of the 36th Wisconsin. And on the right is Lucius Fairchild. Fairchild was colonel of the 2nd Wisconsin. He was wounded at Gettysburg, had an amputation of one of his lower arms. Later served as Secretary of State in Wisconsin and the governor of Wisconsin post-Civil War. Ellsworth moved back to Chicago after commanding the Governor's Guard in Madison in 1859. He began a clerkship at a law office in Chicago with the hope of becoming a lawyer. Now, this all developed out of a relationship that he established with a young girl, Carrie Spafford, when he was in Rockford in the summer. He met her and they had an arrangement to be married. Now, Carrie Spafford's father was one of the leading members of Rockford society. And he, of course, like any future father-in-law, he was interested in how Ellsworth would support his daughter. He encouraged Ellsworth to put aside his love of militia and military drill and take on the law. Becoming a lawyer, that would be a good way to support his daughter if they were to be married. So Ellsworth did that. He went to Chicago, he started a clerkship in the law office. Then in 1859, in April, an invitation for some old friends changed Ellsworth's thinking in the course of history. He was invited at that time to take command of the National Guard Cadets. Now remember, that was one of the groups that happened to be at Camp Sinisippi the preceding year. The National Guard Cadets were looking for a new drill master and leader of their militia company. They had first organized in 1856, but the organization had fallen on hard times. The group was losing membership, was approaching bankruptcy. They were in danger of disbanding and returning their weapons to the state armory. They had to turn everything back in if they were to disband. In desperate straits, they turned to Ellsworth and offered him the command. This is a quote from one of the members of the National Guard cadets before Ellsworth took over. Quote, "We were a military company of the old school, continental uniforms, broad cross belts, bearskin hats, ponderous, heavy and slow. We drilled according to Scott and learned all there was in the tactics. Having nothing new to learn, the interest of the members died out. Our debts increased and we went into bankruptcy in April of 1859. Now, Ellsworth, despite the wishes of his father-in-law, agreed to take command of the Guard cadets, but only until the 4th of July that year. That was the initial agreement that he had. He told them, too, he was going to change the culture of everything that they were doing. And he told them, he said, I told the cadets if they wanted a company of soldiers in every sense of the word and were anxious to make that company a source of improvement morally as well as physically, then I would command them, enforcing the strictest discipline. So not only is Ellsworth going to go about changing what they're learning militarily, but he's also going to attempt to change the overall culture and how they're viewed within the city of Chicago. He started by making membership in the group an outlet for physical exercise. Their armory became a place where young men could learn the science of military techniques and improve themselves morally. He removed all the distractions and objections usually leveled against militia companies. He placed restrictions on the members in regards to drinking, gambling, foul language, entering saloons, billiard halls, or houses of ill fame. He converted the armory, he created a reading room, a library, and he started to host different events within the National Guard Cadets Armory. Just again, to change the overall culture of what was going on for the Guard Cadets. The men of the company took to the new discipline and training, and the results were immediate. Their first public appearance of the newly named United States Zouave Cadets was the annual Chicago 4th of July parade. The company was to parade in front of the entire city as well as the mayor and city council, then present a public demonstration of their drill outside of the Tremont House in downtown Chicago. The day was a huge success for Ellsworth and the men, and Ellsworth wrote the following to Carrie Spafford, his fiancée. Quote, the glorious 4th is past, and the enclosed articles cut from the Chicago newspapers will show you the result of the cadets' drill. It was a triumph, I assure you. One continual round of applause and cheering from the time we commenced the drill until we ceased. Here is a slide talking about some of those moral resolutions for the Guard cadets, some of the new restrictions that Ellsworth placed on them at that time. These are some interesting things that came to us through the Lake County, or the Lake Forest Academy. This is a small ticket into the cadets gymnasium. You can see there it says good until July 1860, entry into the Guard cadets gymnasium. They created a terpsichorean club or a dance club. You can see there in the center, Colonel E.E. Ellsworth, president of that particular club. After the 4th of July parade, Ellsworth decided to stay on with the Zouave cadets. He didn't leave. Their next big goal, and what they were angling for, was the United States Agricultural Society was hosting a fair in Chicago, September 15th of 1859. And there was an open militia company competition to be held in their grounds. The winner of the competition would be crowned their national champion and receive a standard of colors worth $500. The Zouave cadets competed at that agricultural fair and won the prize. Now, they only defeated one other militia company. Only one other company showed up to the contest. And so other militia companies located in the Northeast and the South downplayed that kind of title as national champion that the Zouave cadets felt they had earned. They'd argued that they'd only beaten one other group at the fair, and that the title of national champion was falsely given. Now, Ellsworth was going to answer those doubts. He published in newspapers an offer to pay for travel for any militia company that would come to Chicago and compete against the Zouave cadets for their standard of colors and for the title. The challenge was published across the United States, but no group took him up on his offer. But that was okay for Ellsworth. He was formulating another plan at this time. And the plan was, if the groups won't come to Chicago, I'll take our group on the road. Our group will go to see them. Therefore, Ellsworth began to organize a nationwide 20-city tour for the United States Zouave Cadets that was to begin in the summer of 1860. Now, on this slide is really interesting. Ellsworth, the one on the left, Ellsworth is the second in from the left. You can see him standing. There's a large flag in the background. That is the flag that was awarded to the men after the U.S. Agricultural Fair in Chicago in 1859. The two men on the far right are two other members of the Zouave Cadets. The photograph was taken in New York during the tour of 1860. So just an interesting aside in that flag. So what about the tour? Well, the men began training shortly after January of 1860. They decided they would tour the principal cities of the East and challenge and drill against the best militia companies those cities had to offer. The tour would decide the true national champion and who that title belonged to. Preparations and training necessitated great sacrifices amongst the men of the Zouave Cadets of Chicago. This is a quote from one of them. Training began a full 6 months before we were to leave. Having decided to make the tour, the men had to give up everything except business and the company. All visits to theaters, calls on friends, parties, etc. had to be sacrificed. Every evening except Sundays would be devoted to drill from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. A vote of the men sustained these views. All the military exercises that the men did in preparation for the tour were done while wearing 23-pound knapsacks. Part of the athletic portion of the drill used horizontal bars, ladders, and other gymnastic equipment. Some of the men who weren't willing to go through the sacrifices and time and the physical nature of it dropped out. So that at the end, the tour took 50 men along with Ellsworth that would become part of the Zouave Cadets. Aside from training the men, Ellsworth acted as tour manager, booking agent, travel secretary, spokesman, and chief financial officer and fundraiser. He said this to Cary Spafford about his responsibilities in setting up the tour. Quote, I have to make arrangements for passes or reduction of fare over 3,000 miles of railroad and raise for the company $7,000. A part of this is done by writing nearly 200 letters. Besides this, I have to finish and superintend the publication of our manual of arms. So the training was complete. July 2nd, 1860, the Zouave Cadets of Chicago took their departure from the city. And this is from the Chicago Herald, a quote about their leaving. Quote, the Zouaves took their departure last night, escorted to the cars by the Light Guards and the Highland Guards. The most intense enthusiasm was manifested by our citizens. Upwards of 10,000 persons, old and young, thronged the streets between the armory of the Zouaves and the depot of the Michigan Southern Railroad, while the jam at the latter place was indescribable. Along the lines of march, the housetops and doors and windows were alive with the fluttering of white handkerchiefs. A band of 15 pieces accompanied the U.S. Zouave Cadets. They were known as the Light Guard Band. As I said earlier, a total of 50 men, average age of 22, would bear the sacrifices in training and go on the tour. The first stop after leaving Chicago was Adrian, Michigan, for a demonstration on the 4th of July. From there, they proceeded to Detroit, through Cleveland, through upstate New York, pretty much following the path of the Interstate 90, I guess you would say, through upstate New York, Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, across the top. That was the path of the tour that the men first took after they left Chicago. Now, from the beginning, you see the reports from the newspapers as the Zouave Cadets arrived that it became less about competition and more about welcoming and honoring the Zouave Cadets as they came to town. Their reputation was preceding them as they came in. The Zouave Cadets were welcomed by the local citizenry and military companies and militia companies as honored guests. They were often met at the train depots marched to the armories. They were fed and they were quartered at local militia companies' armories along their tour. And it wasn't uncommon for thousands of people to show up and watch the men either parade through the streets or to perform the drill in these towns as the Zouave Cadets came to their communities. Along the way, the men of the United States Zouave Cadets became celebrities, and Colonel Ellsworth became, quote, the most talked about man in America. In Rochester, New York, for example, it was an unscheduled stop, but people wrote to them, got in touch with them, begged them to stop in Rochester. People came from as far away as 40 miles to see them, and the city spent $500 on fireworks as part of the celebration of their visit. On July 11th, 1860, a tremendous crowd, and this is a quote from one of the local papers, witnessed the exhibition in Utica. The New York Times reported that the group's arrival in New York later that month would be one of the, quote, military sensations of the day. So let's talk about what went on in New York. The Zouave Cadets arrived Saturday on July 14th. They were received by the 6th New York Militia. They had breakfast at the Astor House, the parade through the city streets of New York to the armory of the 6th. At 2:30 in the afternoon, they gave a public drill to an estimated 10,000 spectators that lasted over 3 hours. Monday, July 16th, they did a public drill in Madison Square Park. July 17th, they visited Brooklyn, inspected the Navy Yard, drilled for 20,000 people at Fort Greene, and visited the State Arsenal. On Thursday, July 19th, at the invitation of the prominent citizens of New York, the Zouave Cadets gave an exhibition drill at the Academy of Music for a crowd of nearly 5,000 paid spectators. It's one of only 2 times that the Zouave Cadets charged an admission to see the drill at that Academy of Music. Friday, July 20th, the Zouaves left New York Harbor for Boston after being cheered by a large group of spectators and a 10-gun salute. So why was this so popular? What did the drill consist of? Well, tremendous media coverage, press coverage of the group's travel, and there are some great drawings of them that I'll show you here in just a second. Some of the things that the men were doing to make them so appealing and so eye-catching for the general public. Eyewitness accounts leave us with the following evidence of what the spectators saw. The group came running under the drill in squads of 4. They rapid quick orders were executed accurately and properly, all being timed with rapid movements and symmetry of motion. The men fired at will, fired by file, filed by platoon, fired all together. The men stacked arms, made human ladders, pyramids. They marched and formed different shapes, crosses, parallelograms, and circles. They did a fire in advance drill. The front line fired, opened ranks. The rear line would charge forward with bayonets. They would fire, they would open lines, and that would be repeated. They did parry and thrust drills and fencing demonstrations. They loaded and fired while lying on their backs. They did a tap drill, exercises of the manual drill done to the tap of a drum instead of verbal commands. And then a final all-out charge at the end was really what brought the house down. And this is a direct quote from someone who saw what was going on. The maneuvers of the company were certainly interesting. They would fall to the ground, load their guns, fire, turn over on their backs, fire again, jump up, run a few steps, fall, then crawl on their hands and feet, as silent as cats, climb high stone walls by stepping on each other, making a human ladder. More images of the drill and what was going on. So colorful uniforms, showmanship, athletic exercises were all visually appealing to bring out these huge crowds to the exercises. On July 26, 1860, the group drilled at West Point. They were invited to West Point. They drilled for William Hardee and Winfield Scott at West Point on that day. On August 4th, they were invited to Washington, D.C., where they drilled in the grounds of the White House for President Buchanan. You can see there a long quote from Buchanan explaining the importance of their drill and of the group. After Washington, they started to head west. They returned to Chicago via Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Springfield. The cadets returned to Chicago on August 15th, 1860. Remember, they left on July 2nd, so it was a little over a month and a half long tour. Over 10,000 people welcomed them back to the Wigwam building. You may remember that that's where Lincoln was nominated by the Republican Party in downtown Chicago. They welcomed them back to Chicago, and where the crowd remained until midnight. So it was a great success. Ellsworth had achieved fame, as had the men who went along with him. But why was the tour so successful? And I have three takeaways from it. First was the Zouave system combined the great appeal of the precision of the military drill with the spectacular physical elements calculated to capture the imagination of the viewers and the public. Secondly, the fact that the men also stayed true to their original pledge of moral discipline as far as the consumption of alcohol also brought honor to the tour and renewed respect for militia companies all over the country. And thirdly, I think it was just the force of Ellsworth's charisma, leadership, enthusiasm, knowledge. He had a real persona and a presence about him that drew people in. I think that also helped to make it a big success. So what was the military value of the tour? Well, you see this throughout in the press coverage that the Zouave Cadets received, that after each of these tour stops, the local militia companies wanted to train in the Zouave style after they left. They wanted to know more about it. They wanted to train in the same manner as the Zouave Cadets. In Albany, New York, that happened. Salem, Massachusetts. You see it over and over. And then within the Zouave Cadets, 47 out of the 50 men, those men from Chicago that went with Ellsworth on the tour, went on to serve in some capacity in the Federal Army. 2 served in the Confederacy. Many of these men took to the training that Elmer Ellsworth bestowed on them and became leaders in regiments of their own. Therefore, the training and discipline that Ellsworth instilled in the Zouave Cadets lived on beyond the organization and infiltrated other regiments in Union states. Now, after the tour, the Zouave Cadets did one more drill demonstration in Chicago, and then largely the group disbanded. Ellsworth went south, clerked with Lincoln in his law offices, made a few speeches on the Lincoln campaign for the presidential campaign of 1860. We do know that after Lincoln's election, Ellsworth traveled with the party to Washington, D.C., and he was given a position within the federal government under the Lincoln administration. When the war began, when Sumter was fired on, Ellsworth left Washington, D.C. and traveled to New York to raise his own regiment, become colonel of that regiment. And he raised the 11th New York, and he raised the regiment out of the firehouses and the fire companies of New York City. And there we can see a woodcut of the 11th New York. The 11th New York traveled back to Washington, D.C. They were quartered for a time in the United States Capitol, and then they camped near the Anacostia River in Maryland. Now, some of the men from the Zouave Cadets served as officers with the 11th New York, and we're going to meet some of them in a little bit. We'll name some of these men that were serving as lieutenants in some of the companies of the 11th. Now, we do know that on May 23rd, 1861, Ellsworth and the 11th crossed the Potomac River, entered into Alexandria, Virginia. Their task was to capture the railroad depot in Alexandria and cut the telegraph lines. The story goes that there was a large First National Confederate flag flying above the Marshall House on King Street in Alexandria. Ellsworth went into the hotel, the Marshall House, with a small squadron of men, went up into the attic and took the flag down. As he descended the stairs, he was killed by the proprietor of that hotel, Mr. Jackson, with a shotgun blast chest. Frank Brownell, a member of the 11th New York, ended up killing Jackson in retribution for that act. At the Manassas National Battlefield Park, you can actually see the uniform of Brownell in the 11th New York. It's on display. We were there in the summer or the October of 2019. So you can actually see his uniform that he was wearing that day. There's a picture of Brownell. Company A, 11th New York, wearing the uniform. The flag itself is in the possession, I believe, of the state, New York State. It's part of a collection in New York. So we talked a little bit about Ellsworth's legacy of militia reform, the inspiration for new militia groups. In death, Ellsworth became a rallying cry for the Union cause. You see envelopes, stationery, broadsides calling on loyal Northerners to avenge Ellsworth and join the federal cause. And as you'll see, his training and legacy lived on through the other members of the Zouave Cadets, who became officers and leaders in several prominent federal regiments. Some of these examples are the 11th New York, the 44th New York, and the 19th Illinois. So let's take a look at some of the Zouave Cadet officers who were with Ellsworth on the 20-city tour in the summer of 1860, who went on to become officers within the Federal Army. Some of these pictures are obviously post-war, and this is one of them. George Fergus, First Lieutenant, Company K, 11th New York. After the war, George and his father, Robert, worked together to publish the Fergus Historical Series, 40 volumes and pamphlets on Chicago, Illinois, and the early history of the Northwest. And the Fergus Historical Series comprised the most authoritative history of the early days of Chicago in the state of Illinois. Frank Yates, First Lieutenant in the 11th New York, went on to serve with the 73rd New York, the 18th New York Cavalry. He moved back to Chicago and worked as a telegraph agent for the Board of Trade, continued to teach fencing until he died in 1922. Edward Morton Coates, First Lieutenant, 11th New York, Second Lieutenant, 2nd U.S. Cavalry. You can see his long career, stayed within the U.S. Army until long after the war. He retired as a colonel on July 29, 1900. Died 1913 in Washington, D.C. Now, after Ellsworth's death, the 11th New York participated. They were at First Manassas, or First Bull Run. But after that, many of the members that were with him on the tour in the summer of 1860 left the 11th New York. And several of them went on to become officers with a new organization that was being raised by the state of New York, the 44th New York, also known as Ellsworth's Avengers. The 44th New York was organized from August to October of 1861, sent to Washington, D.C. October 21st, 1861. They fought in every major campaign of the Army of the Potomac. The 3-year men mustered out October 11th, 1864. Colonel Stephen Stryker was one of those men. He was First Lieutenant in Company B of 11th New York. He was commissioned Colonel of the 44th New York on October 12th, 1861. Resigned his commission July 4th, 1862. Come back into the Army, was Lieutenant Colonel of the 11th New York Cavalry there in 1863. Edward Knox, one of the leadership positions within the U.S. Zouave Cadets. He was First Lieutenant, Company A, 11th New York. Went on to become First Lieutenant, Company I of the 44th New York. Promoted to Captain and then Major within the 44th. You can see there he's wounded twice, mustered out with the regiment on October 11th, 1864. Came back to Chicago and died in Chicago in 1890. Freeman Connor. I think Freeman Connor is one of the more interesting stories of all of the men who traveled with the Zouave Cadets in 1860. You can see he was born in Exeter, New Hampshire, 1836. Moved to Chicago at the age of 22. Was with Ellsworth and the men on their tour. First Lieutenant, Company D of the 11th New York. Appointed Captain, Company D of the 44th in August of 1861. Now he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel of the 44th New York on September 2nd, 1862. Wounded twice in the right arm at Fredericksburg and the left shoulder at the Battle of the Wilderness. But really, it's at Gettysburg that I think this is really interesting. Some of you who have been to Gettysburg probably have been to, obviously, to Little Round Top and have seen the large castle-like monument to the 44th New York that's on top of Little Round Top. During the Gettysburg campaign, you know that the 44th New York was brigaded with the 20th Maine, as well as a Pennsylvania regiment, the 83rd Pennsylvania, and I believe it was the 16th Michigan on their right. For a brief time, Lieutenant Colonel Freeman Conti took command of the 20th Maine in late June of 1863, when the commander of the 20th Maine fell out with heat stroke. During the battle, the 44th New York was there right on Little Round Top, July 2nd, 1863. Their colonel was placed in charge of the brigade during the battle of Gettysburg, and who was ultimately in command of the 44th New York when the colonel of the 44th left was Freeman Conti. So here you have a man who's living in Chicago shortly before the start of the Civil War, in command of the 44th New York at this pivotal time in American history. We don't think there aren't that many Illinois regiments that served at the Battle of Gettysburg, but there certainly were men from Chicago represented in the 44th New York and in the regiment. Freeman Conti was one of them. He mustered out the 44th New York on September 24th, 1864, died March 28th, 1906. He's buried in Valparaiso, Indiana. There's a picture of some of the officers of the 44th. Freeman Conti is seated there in the center, front row of the center. Another interesting Chicago connection to the 44th, on July 2nd, 1863, is Lieutenant Lucius LaRue, Company B of the 44th New York. You can see again, he was one of those lieutenants in Company K of the 11th, transferred to Company B of the 44th, mortally wounded, commanding skirmishers, Company B of the 44th on July 2nd, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg. His body was brought back to Chicago, and he's buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. So another Chicagoan at Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863. Similar, Lieutenant William Danks, Company H, 44th New York, served at the 44th until they mustered out in 1864 in Albany. Lieutenant Harrison Kelly. So again, the list goes on and on. These men who were with Ellsworth in Chicago in 1860, taking what he had taught them after his death, becoming parts of different regiments, carrying on his leadership, carrying on what he had taught them and the discipline that he had instilled in them during their time together in the Zouave Cadets. Another regiment that had a prominent number of men from the Zouave Cadets in it was the 19th Illinois. You can see there that companies A, C, and K were made up of some of the Zouave Cadets from Chicago. Company A was sent to guard the Big Muddy Bridge, this Illinois Central Railroad, in 1861. Companies C and K were sent to Cairo, Illinois, at the very southern tip of Illinois, where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers come together to guard that strategic river location. They were riding in a train heading east. There was an accident. You can see that. Early in 1861, 24 men were killed and 105 were seriously wounded. And the 19th ended up serving in the Army of the Cumberland. They served with distinction at the major battles of Stones River, the Tullahoma Campaign, Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, and the Atlanta Campaign. The regiment mustered out on July 9, 1864 in Chicago. Some of the men that were with Ellsworth that I don't have pictures of just yet: John Long, Second Lieutenant, Company A of the 19th. Charles Shepley, Second Lieutenant, Company K, 19th Illinois. Robert Weatherall, Quartermaster of the 19th. James R. Hayden, Samuel S. Boone, William Innes, all either captains or first lieutenants with the 19th Illinois. There's James Claiborne, post-war picture. He was captain of Company K, the 19th Illinois. And Joseph R. Scott, one of those men. You may remember the image of Ellsworth standing in front of the standard of colors in New York. Joseph R. Scott was the man on the far right representing the Zouave Cadets. He was Lieutenant Colonel of the 19th Illinois, promoted to Colonel of the regiment in 1862. He was mortally wounded at the Battle of Stones River on January 2nd, 1863. He was wounded. He lingered for 7 months. You can see he died in Chicago in 1863 of those wounds. Hector Aiken, someone who didn't serve with the 19th Illinois, but was a member of the Zouave Cadets, had another interesting career once the war started. He was Went to Beloit College in Wisconsin, 1854 to 56. He was part of the Chicago Board of Trade Battery, but then became captain, Company B of the 29th USCT in December of 1863. On May 1st, you may recall that regiment was sent to Washington, D.C., and on July 30th, 1864, the 29th participated in the Battle of the Crater. At that battle, Charles Aiken was severely wounded, leading a charge around the crater at that particular engagement, and he died from those wounds 2 days later. Two more men, and we'll finish. Dwight Laughlin, he was also in that image of the Zouave Cadets in front of their standard of colors, just to the left of Joseph Scott. You can see there, president of the Laughlin Powder Company, which was DuPont's leading post-Civil War competitor in the explosives industry. There were several accidents at several of these of their factories. One of them was in the Brighton Park neighborhood in Chicago in 1886. In 1898, the Laughlin and Rand Powder Company purchased 577 acres of land southwest of Kenosha for a powder mill, not too far from where I'm giving this program this morning. In 1907, 2 explosions at the mill killed 10 people. And then again in 1911, there was a nighttime explosion, and that explosion left a 300-foot hole in the ground and could be felt as far away, supposedly, as Iowa and Michigan. So if the Laughlin and Rand Company wanted to come purchase land in your community, you might want to think twice about letting them do that. We know that Laughlin died in Saugerties, New York in 1914. And then finally, let's bring it back full circle. The last person we're going to talk about. Remember that guy who was the expert swordsman, the French connection for Ellsworth in Chicago, Charles Devillier? Well, he became colonel of the 11th Ohio, organized June 20th, 1861. He was captured by Confederates July 17th, 1861, sent to prison in Richmond. Supposedly, he disguised himself as a blind Frenchman and made his escape out of captivity from the Confederates, made his way to Norfolk and rejoined his command, only to be charged with 13 counts of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. He was a court martial. He was removed from command, and so he was probably the most inauspicious of all the people that Ellsworth had connections with pre-Civil War in the city of Chicago. So I hope this talk gives you a new appreciation of Ellsworth. Possibly you've heard of him before, the connections with Lincoln, in command of the 11th New York, his death in Alexandria. Sure, all important parts of his military career. What I really hope you get out of this program is that obviously he had deep connections in the upper Midwest, deep connections within the city of Chicago. And that even though he was the first officer killed, first federal officer killed during the war, his influence lived on with the men that he commanded. And those individuals went on to other commands within the Federal Army throughout the war. Thus, Ellsworth's influence, Ellsworth's command lived on. So thank you so much. Like I said earlier, if any of you find yourself in southeastern Wisconsin, in the Chicago or Milwaukee areas, I hope you'll take the time to come see us at the Civil War Museum.